the stock for the strike price, although you do get to keep that premium that you received up front. So the maximum loss that you could have would be the strike price minus the premium. Now, you may find it helpful to commit the option diagram that we've been working on to memory. And that way, when you're working on option problems or studying for the exam, you can check your thinking. Of course, you can't bring anything into the test with you, but you will be allowed to use scratch paper. And when the exam starts, you could write down this diagram as a memory aid after the exam has begun, and then check your thinking about these 4 basic option positions when you encounter problems about options. Now, some of the types of problems that you may have to deal with are going to ask you to determine the eventual outcome of an option transaction. Now, it's important to note that there are only 3 real possible outcomes to an option transaction that an investor is involved in. Number 1, the option could expire. Number 2, the option could be exercised. And number 3, the option could be liquidated or closed out. So we'll go through each of these 3 possibilities and see what the outcomes might be. Now, some of these problems will involve lots of steps and involve tons of information. So one strategy to keep all of the information straight would be to use a diagram that I call a T-chart, or a paid-received chart. On the left side of the chart, we would list all of the monies the investor has paid out in the problem, which are debits to their account. On the right side, we enter any money that the investor has received during their transactions, which are credits to their account. And once all the information has been entered, we compare the 2 sides. If the investor paid more than they received in the transactions, of course they have a loss. If they've received more than they paid out, then they would have a profit from the transaction. On the other hand, if the amount paid out equals the amount received, the investor has broken even and there is no gain or loss. So this chart can help us look at a systematic technique for going through these option problems, and it can prevent you from overlooking or forgetting about a specific part of the problem that occurs on the exam. So we'll take a look at how we might use this chart to help you solve some of the problems that you might encounter as you're going through this material about making money and losing money on these types of transactions. So let's take a look at an example. First, we're going to look at the options expiring. Now, if we look at this problem, you're purchasing a 30 call for 2. And remember, that's $200. The market value of the stock is 31 at the time. The stock drops to 28, and the option expires unexercised. So what's the investor's gain or loss? Now, the key words here are, what is the profit or loss on the transaction? That's the tip-off, when we see those words, profit or loss. Then we should use the T-chart to solve that problem. So we put our paid and received diagram. Next we ask, did the investor pay or receive in this problem? Since the investor bought the call, the premium would be entered in the paid column. It's also helpful to indicate where the entry came from. So this entry, 30C, indicates that we bought a call with a strike price of 30. So later on, if we're doing a complicated calculation, we can remember where the number came from. Now remember that the option expires in our problem, so it's worthless at that point. So the corresponding entry that we'd made would be received in the received column, since the option brought no return to the investor. So the overall result is the investor has a loss of $200. In this case, the amount paid was greater than the amount received, and we did have a loss. Let's do another example. In this particular case, we're going to deal with the seller. Now, this seller sold the put at 13. Okay, there is a $1,300 premium. The stock was at 101 when they did that. The stock remains there through November and the option expires. So what's the investor's profit or loss? Again, the words profit or loss indicate that we should use a paid received chart in order to solve this problem. So we put up a paid received chart. Since this investor sold a put, remember, we're selling, so we receive the premium. So the premium goes on the received or credit side, $1,300 in this case. And of course, this entry just reminds us that we are selling a 100 put. Now, later, the option expires, so that's another key in the problem. Of course, what that means is that the investor no longer has an obligation to buy stock. They will not have to pay out any money. Now, remember, the option's just expiring. Therefore, the investor will earn the $1,300 premium in this particular case. Now, these examples are relatively simple, so you might think, well, why do we need all this technique of using a T-chart? Well, we're going to be looking at some very different problems that are a bit more complicated, in which several things are going on, and it's real helpful for you to have a T-chart because you can track through each transaction that occurs in the problem and then the end result is comparing the total paid to the total received. Now, the second possibility to which we'll apply this technique is the possibility that the option could be exercised. So let's take a look at that particular type of example. In this case, we're buying a call for $400 with a $20 strike price. The stock is at $22.50. Later, the stock rises, and then the investor exercises the call and sells the stock. So notice already that there are a lot of things going on in the problem, and we need to keep track of all of them. The eventual thing that we have to find is clear: the gain or loss. Now, the words, "what is the gain or loss?" would lead us to set up this T-chart. So the first transaction is the purchase of the call. So the first thing we do is we buy the call option. So we have to pay the premium, and $400 is entered in the paid column. Again, this entry reminds us that this was for buying a 20 call. Now next, the stock rises to 26, and that right there does not cause us to make an entry. This is just what is happening in the stock market. However, what does the investor do next? Well, the investor exercises the call. Well, what does that mean? Now remember that if you own a call, that means you have the right to buy the stock at the strike price, which in this case is $20 per share. So you are going to be buying some stock, and that of course creates a new entry: 100 shares of EXP for $2,000. So that creates a second entry in our diagram because we do have the stock position at this point. Next, we are told that the investor sells the stock in the market at 26 for $2,600. Now we're done. We've used up the call, we've bought and sold the stock, and now we're ready to total up each side. So we find that the investor has paid out $2,400 and received $2,600 for a profit of $200. So then notice that these more complicated problems have several entries, and it certainly helps to be able to go through systematically and make sure that we've included all the entries that are in the problems so we don't overlook some critical part of the problem. Then we just net out the transactions in the end. Here, let's try one more example because these can be a little bit more complicated. In this particular case, the stock is selling for $158, and the investor does sell a call at that point for $600. The stock goes up, and the investor is assigned. Now, what's the profit or loss? Again, the words profit or loss imply that we should use a T-chart to help solve the problem. So what's the first thing the investor did? Well, the investor sold a call. That's the first action that they took. Therefore, they will receive a premium. In this particular case, $600 for writing the 160 call. Now later, the problem says that the stock rose and the investor was assigned. Now, what does that mean for this investor to get an assignment? Well, they are the writer of the call. So since they wrote the call, they have an obligation to deliver the stock to the buyer. But notice that we have a problem here. The setup does not tell us that the investor has the stock. We cannot assume that the investor does. So what we're going